What did the waitress say to my girlfriend that made her dump me? We were at this new French restaurant celebrating our anniversary when the waitress leaned over and whispered something in Olivia's ear. After 5 seconds, my girlfriend's face changed from happy and laughing to completely horrified, like she'd just learned someone had died. The waitress walked away without another word, and Olivia wouldn't even look at me after that. I asked her what the waitress said, but she just shook her head and stared at her plate without eating another bite. When I asked again what was wrong, she just stood up and walked out. She was already in her car by the time I'd paid the check, and when I knocked on her window, she just mouthed, "It's over," and drove away. I went back inside to find the waitress, but the manager said she'd clocked out right after serving our table. The manager wouldn't give me her contact information and asked me to leave when I started getting upset. Olivia blocked my phone number that same night and wouldn't answer her door the next morning. Her roommate came out and said I needed to leave immediately, or she'd call the police. The look on her face was pure disgust, like I'd done something unforgivable. My first thought was maybe the waitress was someone I'd hooked up with before dating Olivia, who wanted revenge for some reason. But I'd never seen her before in my life, and I'd only dated 2 people before Olivia. I tracked down both my exes and asked if they knew anyone who worked at that restaurant, but they had no idea what I was talking about. Then I thought maybe the waitress had confused me with someone else and told Olivia I was cheating. I went back to the restaurant trying to find her, but the manager finally told me she'd quit without notice the day after our dinner and hadn't even picked up her last paycheck. None of the other servers knew where she'd gone. I tried to think if the waitress could have known something about my family that I'd never told Olivia, but my parents were boring accountants, and my sister was a teacher. There were no family secrets that would make someone react like that. I called my mom and asked if we had any family scandals I didn't know about. She just laughed and said our family was disappointingly normal. I hired a private investigator thinking maybe I'd been drugged and done something I didn't remember. He found the waitress had worked at 6 different restaurants in the past 2 years and quit all of them. At one place, she'd been fired for telling a customer their husband was at another table with someone else. When they checked, the husband was at home. The woman still divorced him anyway. The investigator tracked the waitress to a truck stop diner 4 states away. When he showed her my picture, she said, "Oh, him," like she recognized me but wouldn't say from where. She told him she'd only whispered 1 sentence to Olivia, and it was something anyone could have noticed if they'd been paying attention. When he asked what she'd noticed, she said it wasn't about what she saw, but about what was missing. The investigator went back to the waitress with more questions, but she'd already quit the truck stop job and disappeared again. Her co-worker there said she'd left after serving a young couple their breakfast and whispering something to the woman who'd immediately started crying. The couple left without eating. The woman had been heard saying 37 times, over and over, but nobody knew what that meant. 3 months later, I was at the grocery store when I heard Olivia's laugh from the next aisle. I abandoned my cart and ran around the corner to find her standing there with her sister looking completely normal. When she saw me, her face went white, and she grabbed her sister's arm. I was already walking toward them, begging her to just tell me what the waitress had said. Olivia's sister stepped between us, but Olivia put her hand on her shoulder and said it was okay. She looked at me for the first time in 3 months, and her eyes were full of tears. She said, "I need you to answer one question, and if you answer it correctly, I'll know the waitress was wrong, and we can forget this whole thing happened." I said I'd answer anything, and she pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. It was a picture of me from our second date at the beach 3 years ago, but there was something circled in red marker. She zoomed in on the circle and said, "I need you to explain this." When I looked closer at what she was showing me, my blood went completely cold, because I finally understood what the waitress must have seen. The photo showed me standing on the beach with Olivia and 2 other couples we'd met that day, all of us smiling in the bright sun, with our shadows stretched out behind us on the sand, except I didn't have one. My shadow was completely missing, even though everyone else's was clear and dark on the ground, and when I looked up at Olivia's face, I could see she was watching me realize what was wrong. My hands started shaking so bad, I almost dropped her phone while the grocery store seemed to spin around me. Olivia's sister took a step backward and bumped into an old woman pushing her cart, who gave us a dirty look before moving away. More shoppers were starting to slow down and stare at us standing there in the middle of the cereal aisle, with me shaking like I was having some kind of breakdown. I tried to say something, but my mouth was completely dry, and when I opened it, nothing came out except this weird croaking sound. My throat felt like I'd swallowed sand, and I had to swallow 3 times before I could even whisper that I didn't understand what I was looking at. Olivia's face changed from angry to something else, maybe pity or confusion, and she swiped to another photo on her phone. This one was from earlier that same beach day, according to the timestamp in the corner, maybe an hour before the other picture. And in this one, I had a normal shadow, just like everyone else. She held both photos up side by side on her phone screen, swiping back and forth between them to show how my shadow was there in one and gone in the other. My legs started feeling like jelly, and I had to grab the shelf next to me to keep from falling over, knocking a box of cornflakes onto the floor. Olivia asked me straight out if I knew why my shadow disappeared between those two photos, her voice shaking but determined. I told her honestly that I had no idea what she was talking about, or how something like that was even possible. Her sister looked between us, and then at the growing crowd of shoppers pretending to look at groceries, while obviously watching our drama unfold. She suggested we should probably take this somewhere more private since people were pulling out their phones, and it looked like someone might be recording us. Olivia nodded and said there was a coffee shop 2 blocks away where we could talk without an audience. We agreed to meet there in 10 minutes, and I watched them walk quickly toward the exit, while I stood there still holding onto the shelf for support. I somehow made it to my car and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, trying to think of any way a person could lose their shadow in a photo. Maybe it was some kind of weird photo editing mistake, or the angle of the sun had created an optical illusion, but even as I thought it, I knew those explanations made no sense. The sun was in the same position for everyone in both photos, and nobody accidentally edits out just one person's shadow while leaving everything else perfect. I drove to the coffee shop in a daze and found Olivia and her sister already sitting at a corner table away from the other customers. Olivia had her phone out and was pulling up more photos, spreading them across the table by turning her phone sideways and swiping through them slowly. She pointed to each one, showing me birthday parties and date nights and random selfies from our 3 years together, and in some I had a shadow, and in some I didn't. There was no pattern I could see, no connection between the photos where my shadow was missing and the ones where it appeared normal. Different times of day, different places, inside and outside, summer and winter. It didn't matter, because the shadow came and went, with no logic at all. I picked up her phone with trembling hands and zoomed in on photo after photo, checking the edges and looking for any sign of editing or manipulation. But they were all just regular photos taken on her phone, nothing special or altered about them, except for the fact that sometimes I existed without a shadow. The coffee shop noise faded away as I stared at proof of something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, but was right there in dozens of photos spanning years. Olivia finally broke the silence by telling me what the waitress had whispered to her that night at the restaurant. She said the waitress had leaned in close and said to look at what was missing from me, not what was there, and Olivia hadn't understood what that meant. She thought maybe the waitress was being weird or philosophical, talking about missing emotions or something like that, until she got home that night and started going through our photos. That's when she noticed my shadow was missing in the photo from dinner that was on her Instagram, the one she'd posted right before dessert came, and once she saw it, she couldn't stop looking through every photo she had of me. She found 37 photos where my shadow was gone, which explained what that woman at the truck stop had been saying, and the more she looked, the more terrified she became about what I might be. I looked straight at her and asked if she really thought a person could just lose their shadow at random times, like it was some kind of normal thing. She stared back at me with this expression that was part fear and part sadness, and told me she didn't know what to believe anymore, but something was clearly wrong with me. Her sister had already pulled out her phone and was scrolling through article after article about shadow disappearances in old stories and myths from different cultures. She turned the screen toward me, showing how almost every culture had some belief about people without shadows being cursed or having sold their souls or lost their humanity. My stomach twisted into knots reading the words on her screen, because none of this made any sense, but the evidence was right there in the photos. I told them I was still the same person Olivia had fallen in love with 3 years ago, and I hadn't made any deals with the devil or done anything evil. But right as the words came out of my mouth, I glanced at the coffee shop wall behind us, where the afternoon sun was making clear shadows of everyone in the place. Olivia's shadow was there on the wall, and so was her sister's, but where mine should have been, there was nothing at all. The wall was just blank, where my body should have been blocking the light and creating a dark shape like everyone else had. Olivia saw me looking and followed my gaze to the wall, and when she saw the empty space where my shadow should be, she started crying hard. She said through her tears that she couldn't be with someone when she didn't even know if they were fully human anymore. I reached across the table to touch her hand and try to comfort her, but she pulled away fast, like my touch might burn her skin. That's when something popped into my head that I hadn't thought about in years and years. When I was 7 years old, my family went camping at this state park, about 2 hours from our house. On the second day, I wandered off following a butterfly or something, and got completely lost in the woods. I was missing for 6 whole hours before a park ranger found me sitting by a creek, just staring at the water. The weird thing was, I had no memory at all of what happened during those 6 hours. My parents asked me over and over where I'd been and what I'd done, but my mind was totally blank about that time. I told Olivia about the camping trip and getting lost when I was 7, and she immediately asked if that's when this shadow thing started. I had to admit I'd never paid any attention to my shadow before I met her, so I honestly had no idea how long this had been going on. Her sister put down her phone and suggested maybe I should see a doctor or a psychiatrist to figure out what was wrong with me. I agreed right away, because I was desperate for any kind of answer, even though I had no clue what kind of medical professional would know anything about missing shadows. Olivia wiped her eyes with a napkin and said she needed time to process all of this crazy stuff and asked me not to contact her for at least 2 weeks. I wanted to argue and beg her to stay and work through this together, but I could see in her face that she needed space, so I agreed. The thought of not talking to her for 2 whole weeks made my chest feel hollow and empty, but I nodded and said, okay. We all stood up from the table at the same time, and they walked out together while I stayed behind to pay for the coffees nobody had touched. The barista gave me a weird look when she saw me sitting alone at the table with 3 full cups, but she didn't say anything. I drove home in a daze, barely paying attention to the road and almost missing my turn into my apartment complex. That night, I pulled out every photo album my parents had given me when I moved out and spread them across my living room floor. I went through each picture with a magnifying glass I found in my desk drawer, looking at every shadow in every photo. There were pictures from birthday parties and family vacations and school events going back to when I was a baby. I spent hours examining them one by one, checking to see if my shadow was there or not in each photo. What I discovered made my hands shake as I held the magnifying glass over the old photos. In every single picture from before that camping trip when I was 7, my shadow appeared completely normal, just like everyone else's. But in the photos taken after I got lost in the woods, my shadow was there sometimes, and missing other times with no pattern I could figure out. A Christmas morning photo from when I was 8 showed me opening presents with no shadow, while my sister right next to me had hers. A school picture from 3rd grade had my shadow, but a family reunion photo from that same summer didn't have it at all. The camping trip was clearly when whatever this was had started happening to me, but I still had no memory of those missing 6 hours in the woods. I picked up my phone and called my mom right away, even though it was past midnight. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding confused, and asked if everything was okay. I told her I needed to know more about that camping trip when I was 7, and specifically what happened after they found me. She yawned and said I'd come back acting weird for a few days, not talking much and staring at nothing, but then I seemed to get back to normal, so they never worried about it. I pressed her for more details, but she honestly couldn't remember much else since it was over 20 years ago. After hanging up, I couldn't sleep at all, so I opened my laptop and started searching for anything about people losing their shadows. Most of what I found was fairy tales and horror stories, but after digging deeper, I found some forums where people claimed similar things were happening to them. One post really caught my attention from someone describing how their boyfriend's shadow would disappear whenever he seemed emotionally checked out. They said it was like he wasn't fully there in those moments, like part of him existed somewhere else entirely. Reading that made me think about all the times Olivia had complained that I seemed distant, even when I was sitting right next to her. She'd wave her hand in front of my face and ask where I'd gone, and I'd always insisted I was right there listening, but maybe she was picking up on something I couldn't even feel myself. After 3 straight days of reading forums and articles without sleeping more than a few hours, I decided I had to go back to those woods. My parents still lived in the same house near that state park, so I drove out there early one morning without telling them I was coming. The park entrance looked exactly the same as it had in all our old family photos. I parked at the same campground we'd used and started walking the main trail, trying to remember which way 7-year-old me might have wandered off. The woods felt familiar but wrong at the same time, like when you walk into a room and all the furniture has been moved just a few inches from where it should be. I followed the old hiking trail for about an hour, then started checking smaller paths that branched off into the deeper parts of the forest. Something pulled me toward a narrow deer trail that led downhill toward where I could hear water running. About a mile in, I found this huge oak tree that made my skin crawl the second I saw it. The bark had symbols carved deep into it, old and weathered, but definitely put there on purpose by someone. They weren't letters or numbers, but strange shapes that hurt to look at directly, and something about them felt familiar, in a way I couldn't explain. I took out my phone to photograph the symbols, and noticed something bizarre in the camera screen. In the photos, my shadow showed up perfectly normal on the ground, but when I looked down with my own eyes, there was nothing there, even though the sun was bright overhead. I took dozens of pictures from different angles, and my shadow appeared in every single one, but I couldn't see it myself, no matter how hard I looked. On the drive home, I stopped at the county library to research those symbols. The librarian, an older woman with thick glasses, helped me find the local history section, but got this uncomfortable look on her face when I showed her my sketches of the symbols. She brought me a stack of books about regional folklore and Native American history, then excused herself quickly like she didn't want to be near me. I spent hours going through the books, until I finally found something in an old journal from the 1800s. The symbols matched drawings of something called shadow walking in local Native American stories. According to the journal, shadow walkers were people caught between the physical world and the spirit world, not fully existing in either place. The next page had more details about what these shadow walkers actually were, and my hands started shaking as I read it. The legend said they were people who'd been touched by the spirit world, but came back incomplete, existing in both realms at the same time, which explained why their shadows would come and go. I kept reading, and found a part that made my stomach drop. The book said shadow walkers often didn't know what they were because they couldn't perceive their own condition and only other people could see what was missing, which explained how the waitress spotted it right away. I closed the book and sat there for a minute before pulling out my phone to call Silas Hancock, this guy I knew from growing up, who always knew all the weird local stories. He picked up on the third ring, and when I told him I needed to ask about shadow walkers, he got really quiet. After a long pause, he admitted his grandmother used to talk about them, but always said it was dangerous to even discuss the subject. I begged him to meet me, and after some convincing, he agreed to come to this diner off Route 9. When he walked in an hour later, he looked nervous and kept checking over his shoulder like someone might be watching us. He slid into the booth across from me and told me what his grandmother had shared with him years ago. Shadow walkers weren't evil, but they weren't entirely human anymore either, caught between worlds and unable to fully connect with either one. He said his grandmother knew ways to test for shadow walkers and looked at me for a long time before offering to try one on me. I agreed immediately because I was desperate for confirmation of what I already suspected was true about myself. He drove us to his house, which was empty since his wife had left him 2 years ago, and led me to a small room with no windows. He handed me a candle and told me to light it and hold it while looking in the mirror he'd set up against the wall. Normal people would see their reflection and shadow clearly, but when I held the candle up, my reflection kept flickering like it wasn't sure whether to be there or not. Silas took 3 steps back from me after the test, and I could see real fear in his eyes. He said his grandmother had warned that shadow walkers could drain the life force from people close to them without even meaning to. That hit me hard, and I thought about all my past relationships, how they'd all ended with the other person looking tired and worn down. I'd always figured we just weren't compatible, but now I wondered if I'd been literally draining them without knowing it. Silas went to his bedroom and came back with this old leather journal that looked like it was falling apart. He pushed it across the table toward me and said it had more information about shadow walkers that his grandmother had collected over the years. Then he asked me to leave and not contact him again because he had kids to protect and couldn't risk having me around them. I took the journal and left without arguing because the look on his face told me there was no point trying to change his mind. Back at my apartment that night, I opened the journal and started reading the cramped handwriting that covered every page. The first entry explained that shadow walkers were created when a child's soul got partially pulled into the spirit realm, but not completely taken. The child would survive, but remain forever split between 2 worlds, never fully belonging to either one. There were newspaper clippings taped to some pages about unexplained disappearances of children who later returned acting different. One article from 1963 described a boy who went missing for 8 hours in the same woods where I'd gotten lost. When he came back, his parents said he seemed hollow somehow, like part of him was still missing. The journal had drawings of those same symbols I'd found carved in the tree, with notes about how they marked places where the boundary between worlds was thin. According to the grandmother's research, these spots were where spirits could reach through and touch people in our world. She'd mapped out dozens of these locations across 3 states, and I recognized several places I'd been drawn to over the years without understanding why. One entry described how shadow walkers aged differently than normal people because part of them existed outside normal time. That made me think about how people always said I looked younger than my age and how I never seemed to get sick like everyone else. The journal mentioned that animals could sense shadow walkers and would act strange around them. I remembered how dogs would either bark at me for no reason or refuse to come near me at all. There was a whole section about relationships and how shadow walkers couldn't form complete bonds with normal people. The grandmother wrote that it was like trying to hold water in your hands because the connection would always leak away through the gaps. She'd documented cases of shadow walkers who'd tried to have families but always ended up alone because their partners would eventually feel the drain and leave. Near the end of the journal was a list of other people the grandmother suspected were shadow walkers, based on her observations. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but one stood out, because it was someone I'd met years ago who'd seemed to recognize something in me that I didn't understand at the time. The next page in the journal had a whole section about how shadow walkers could never really connect with anyone, because part of them was always somewhere else. The grandmother wrote that they could go through all the motions of a normal life, but their relationships would always feel empty to both people involved. She described it like trying to hug someone through a thick blanket, where you could feel the pressure, but never the warmth. I kept reading, and found case after case of shadow walkers who'd tried to have normal families, but ended up alone because their partners always sensed something was missing. One story from 1973 talked about a man whose wife said living with him felt like being married to a ghost who could sometimes touch things. The journal had newspaper clippings about divorces where one spouse claimed their partner wasn't really there even when sitting right next to them. I turned the page, and my hands started shaking when I saw an entry from 1954 about a woman who could spot shadow walkers on sight. The grandmother's description of her was exact down to the details, like she had dark hair that she kept in a bun, and eyes that seemed to look through people instead of at them. This woman would show up at restaurants and diners where couples were eating, and she'd whisper something to the normal person about what their partner really was. The grandmother wrote that these people were called seers, and they existed fully in the physical world, which let them see what was missing in others. According to the journal, seers felt pulled to reveal the truth about shadow walkers, like it was their purpose in life. They couldn't stand watching normal people waste their lives with someone who could never fully be there. The grandmother had interviewed 3 different seers over the years, and they all said the same thing about feeling sick when they saw a shadow walker with someone normal. One seer described it as watching someone slowly drowning while thinking they were just swimming. The journal said seers would often quit their jobs and move on after revealing the truth because they couldn't handle seeing the aftermath. I spent the next 2 weeks reading every page of that journal and trying to understand what I was. During that time, I didn't leave my apartment except to get food, and I ignored calls from my family who were worried about me. When the 2 weeks were up, I sent Olivia a text, asking if we could meet to talk about everything. She replied within an hour saying yes, but that she was bringing someone named Xander Swift, who was a therapist she'd been seeing who dealt with unusual situations. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and I got there early to prepare what I wanted to say. Olivia walked in with a man who looked about 40, with gray hair and glasses, who introduced himself as Xander. They sat across from me, and I started explaining everything I'd learned about shadow walkers from the journal. I told them about getting lost in the woods as a kid and how my shadow had been missing ever since in photos. Xander listened without interrupting while Olivia sat completely still in her chair with her arms crossed. When I finished talking, Xander leaned forward and said that whether the shadow walker thing was real or just a metaphor, the fact was, I couldn't form complete connections with people. He said he'd worked with other clients who described similar feelings of being disconnected from the world around them. Xander offered to work with me to understand what was happening, and maybe find ways to be more present in my life. Before I could answer, Olivia finally spoke and said she still loved me, but couldn't be with someone who might be draining her without meaning to. She said since we'd been apart, she'd been sleeping better and had more energy than she'd had in years. Her words hit me like a punch in the stomach, because it meant the journal was right about shadow walkers draining people. Olivia stood up to leave but stopped and said she hoped I'd take Xander's offer, because maybe he could help me become whole again. After she left, Xander gave me his card and said to call when I was ready to start working on whatever this was. I called him the next day and started seeing him twice a week at his office across town. During our sessions, he helped me see that I'd always felt disconnected from reality, regardless of what caused it. He had me describe memories from childhood, and I realized that even my happiest moments felt flat, like I was watching them happen to someone else. Xander said this feeling of watching life through glass was common in people who'd experienced trauma, even if they couldn't remember what happened. We worked on exercises to help me feel more grounded in the physical world, starting with simple breathing techniques. He had me focus on physical sensations, like the feeling of my feet on the floor or the temperature of the air on my skin. The exercises were hard at first, because my mind would drift to that missing part of me that might be stuck somewhere else. Xander taught me meditation practices, where I'd sit still and try to feel fully present in my body for just a few minutes at a time. My shadow never came back in photos, but I started noticing small changes in how I experienced things around me. Colors felt brighter, and sounds seemed clearer, but it was hard to tell if that was real or just me paying more attention. After a month of sessions with Xander, I decided to reach out to Julie Morrow, who used to be married to Silas. I found her number in an old phone book at the library and called her one evening. She answered on the third ring, and when I explained who I was, she got quiet for a long moment. Then she told me to meet her at a diner the next morning because she had things to tell me about Silas and his grandmother's stories. I drove to the diner early and waited in a booth by the window drinking coffee. Julie showed up right on time wearing scrubs like she'd just gotten off a hospital shift. She sat down across from me and ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. She told me she'd left Silas because he'd become obsessed with his grandmother's stories about shadow walkers and other local legends. He'd started seeing signs everywhere and convinced himself that half the people in town were secretly something else. Julie said the stories consumed their marriage until she couldn't take it anymore. She explained how these legends affected people who believed them and made them see patterns that weren't really there. But then she looked at me carefully and said sometimes the patterns were real, and that's what made it so hard. Julie gave me a business card for a support group that met every Tuesday at the community center. She said the group was for people who felt disconnected from reality for different reasons. Some called it shadow walking, while others called it dissociation or depersonalization. The next Tuesday, I went to the meeting and found 12 people sitting in a circle on metal chairs. They welcomed me without asking too many questions and let me just listen at first. Each person shared their experience of feeling partially absent from their own life. One woman said she felt like she was watching herself from outside her body. A man described feeling like there was glass between him and the rest of the world. Another person talked about moments where they forgot they existed until someone spoke to them. I went to the meetings every week for months and slowly started sharing my own story. The group helped me understand I wasn't alone in feeling split between worlds. We shared techniques for staying grounded and present, even when part of us felt missing. 6 months after that grocery store encounter with Olivia, I was at the farmer's market buying tomatoes. I heard her laugh from across the market and looked up to see her standing by the flower stand. She was with someone new, a tall guy with dark hair who had his arm around her waist. She looked healthy in a way I'd never seen before, with color in her cheeks and a genuine smile. When our eyes met across the crowd, she gave me a small nod of acknowledgement. The guy she was with noticed and looked at me too, but she touched his arm and said something that made him relax. They walked away together, and I watched them disappear into the crowd. It hurt seeing her so happy with someone else, but it also brought me a strange kind of peace. She'd found someone who could be fully present with her, in a way I never could. Over the next few months, I started dating again, but learned to be honest from the start. On first dates, I'd explain that I had a condition that made me feel disconnected sometimes. I'd tell them about the missing shadow and what it might mean. Most people thought I was crazy and never called again. A few were curious enough to go on second dates, but usually ended things when they realized how serious I was. One woman lasted 3 weeks before telling me she couldn't handle being with someone who might not be fully there. The private investigator called me out of nowhere 8 months after our last contact. He said he'd been following leads on his own time and finally found the waitress again. She was working at a hospital in another state as some kind of patient advocate. When he'd shown her my picture and asked about me, she'd smiled and said she hoped I finally understood what I was. He asked her to explain, but she just said some people need to discover their own truth. The investigator gave me the hospital's name and her new fake name she was using there. I thought about calling or visiting, but decided against it. Instead, I sat down and wrote her a long letter thanking her for what she'd done. I explained how her whisper to Olivia had destroyed my life, but also saved it. I wrote about finding the Shadow Walker information and learning what I really was. I told her I understood now why she felt compelled to reveal these truths to people. I sealed the letter in an envelope but never sent it. It sat in my desk drawer for weeks before I finally threw it away. The act of writing it had been enough. I started a blog about living with one foot in another realm and was surprised when people started reading it. Others shared their experiences of feeling partially absent or disconnected from reality. We formed an online community of people who understood what it meant to not be fully present. My shadow never returned consistently in photos, though sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye. I made peace with being split between worlds and found purpose in helping others who felt the same way. Looking back now, I understand what the waitress saw that night at the restaurant. She saw what was missing from me, which wasn't just my shadow, but my full presence in this world. I'm grateful she helped Olivia escape before I drained too much of her light. I'm learning to live with what I am and finding ways to protect the people around me from the emptiness I carry. I really appreciate you hanging in there with me today. All the questioning, all the wondering. It's been so meaningful to explore these moments with you. Until we meet again. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.